I'd like to welcome our second panel, Representative Fischbach. You can deliver either from your chair or that would be fine. From the Committee on Ways and Means, and Representative Fischbach, I welcome your testimony.
This is my first time before the Rules Committee, so be kind.
Gentlelady's recognized for testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today, we're considering the Supporting Pregnant and Parenting Women and Families Act, which would block the Biden administration rule that attempts to divert resources away from pregnancy resource centers that provide life-saving and life-affirming services and resources to pregnant women and their families. I am proud to have introduced this legislation along with my Ways and Means colleague, Representative Claudia Tenney from New York, who couldn't be here because she is her flight is delayed, and Representative Chris Smith from New Jersey. In October of last year, the Department of Health and Human Services published a proposed rule that could prohibit states from funding pregnancy resource centers through the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, the block grant program. If this rule takes effect, women in America will have fewer alternatives to abortion and less access to maternal care. The Supporting Pregnant and Parenting Women and Families Act protects pregnant women from women's access to maternal care by prohibiting HHS from finalizing, implementing, or enforcing the proposed rule as it relates to placing restrictions on the state use of TANF dollars for pregnancy resource centers. Pregnancy resource centers provide vital resources used by pregnant and parenting women every day to support the health and pregnancy of their child. Nothing in the bipartisan law that created TANF provides the Biden administration the authority to regulate TANF in this manner and unfairly single out and target these centers. Pregnancy resource centers provide everything from diapers, food, baby clothes, transportation, parenting classes, relationship education, and prenatal vitamins. They provide both emotional support and tangible benefits and materials to women with unplanned pregnancies that clearly meet the purposes of TANF to provide assistance to needy families and reduce dependence on government assistance. Flexibility for states to use TANF dollars is at the heart of the bipartisan law that created the block grant in 1996. In fact, the primary goal of the legislation was to increase the flexibility of states, which is exactly why Congress explicitly prohibited federal bureaucrats from telling states how and where to spend these funds. The Biden administration is attempting to sidestep Congress with the proposed rule, which is a clear violation of the law, while furthering their agenda to mischaracterize and spread false information of the goals and purpose of pregnancy resource centers. No one says TANF is perfect, but the role of improving the program lies with Congress. Not only is the Biden administration ignoring the law, but in the process, they are also penalizing vulnerable women trying to protect their own health and the health of their children. Democrats claim to support a woman's right to choose their own health care, but at this moment, the Biden administration is preparing to make it harder for moms to choose life for their unborn child, as well as how they will take care of themselves and their babies. If this rule takes effect, pregnant women in America will have fewer alternatives to abortion and less access to vital services and support. Congress must send a clear message that we will not tolerate federal bureaucrats ignoring the letter of the law, and we will stand up and support women. Women should not be denied access to these critical centers for the sake of a political agenda. I hope that each one of my colleagues will support this legislation to stop the Biden administration's attack on pregnant and parenting mothers and their families. And thank you, Mr. Chairman and members.
Thank you very much. Obviously, the weather's made travel difficult. I'm recognizing my friend from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for I think to read into the record a statement by Representative Pugh, who obviously had travel difficulties in getting here today as well.
Yes, not everyone's as hardy as the members of the Rules Committee, but travel has certainly been difficult for people. My colleague, Representative Chu, couldn't be here, so she has asked me to present her remarks on 6918. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McGovern, I'm dismayed that today the Rules Committee meets not to consider serious legislation that will improve the lives of Americans, but to consider a bill merely intended to score political points with attendees at this week's anti-abortion rally here in Washington. This partisan Republican bill, H.R. 6918, would divert funds from needy children and families to anti-abortion centers. These so-called crisis pregnancy centers masquerade as healthcare facilities, usually providing misleading or inaccurate medical information in order to prevent women from seeking abortions. Specifically, the bill would block the Biden administration from monitoring state spending of temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF dollars, for so-called crisis pregnancy centers. In effect, it would permanently exempt from regulation and oversight state expenditure of federal TANF dollars on these centers. Everyone deserves access to accurate information when making healthcare decisions. Anti-abortion centers are not legitimate healthcare providers. Rather, they are organizations attempting to coerce pregnant people seeking abortions into carrying pregnancies to term, using manipulation and misinformation. They often disguise themselves as genuine health centers, even going so far as to dress their staff in scrubs or white coats to mimic medical professionals. Because these anti-abortion centers are not actual medical facilities, they are not covered by the privacy and security rules of HIPAA, and therefore their staff can say whatever they want without consequence. So these centers pose as medical facilities, spread misinformation about abortion, and then face little, if any, consequences for doing so. This has profound impact for the patients that find their way to these centers, believing falsely that their staff are real medical professionals. In Iowa, an OBGYN has seen patients who visited these centers and were told that using contraceptives was the same as having an abortion, that using birth control could give them cancer and would damage their overall health. In Massachusetts, one of these centers failed to correctly diagnose an ectopic pregnancy because the staff member conducting her ultrasound wasn't qualified to be conducting that test. The woman later required emergency surgery. And in my home state, this is from Rep. Chu of California, our Attorney General has sued one operator of these centers for their false claims of offering so-called abortion reversal, which is a procedure that not only does not exist, but attempts to implement it can cause life-threatening hemorrhaging in women. A recent study of 607 anti-abortion centers across 9 states, covering almost 2/3 of these anti-abortion centers, found that they, quote, promoted patently false and/or biased medical claims about pregnancy, abortion, contraceptive, and reproductive health care providers, unquote. Fewer than half reported having a licensed medical professional on staff. During our markup last week, Democrats offered a series of amendments to allow funding to these centers if they could be demonstrated to provide medically accurate information, not harm women's health or economic futures, and did not mislead women as to their purpose or use coercion to get them to visit them. Committee Republicans rejected all of those amendments, making clear that their purpose is coercive propaganda, not support for pregnant women. If you want to support parents, Democrats on the Ways and Means Committee would welcome the support for things like the enhanced and increased child tax credit, paid family and medical leave, and making child care affordable for working families. Instead, we are debating a bill that has no hope of becoming law, that is not a serious attempt to help families, and that is merely an attempt to appease a far-right fringe group in town for its annual conference. In fact, this bill is to serious pro-family legislation what so-called crisis pregnancy centers are to actual responsible medical care, a sham masquerading as something helpful. The best we can do to support pregnant women and families today is to reject this legislation. With that, I yield the balance of Ms. Chu's time.
I thank the gentlelady for reading our colleague's statement into the record. I have no questions for our witnesses. I'll go next to my friend, Dr. Burgess.
No questions, Chairman. I want to thank both our witnesses, both in abstention and in front of us. I have had the opportunity to visit pregnancy centers in my district. I found them to be staffed by very compassionate people. They provide access to information about things like formula, diapers, and what other resources are available in the community. So I think they are important, and a little bit mystified as to why the administration has singled them out for criticism, but Thank you to our colleague, Ms. Fischbach, for bringing this, and look forward to voting for it on the floor tomorrow.
Thank you. Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized for any questions he may have.
Yeah, and let me say, Ms. Chu referenced in her testimony a Massachusetts pregnancy center. That happens to be in my district, not too far from my district office in Worcester. And it is, and the reason why there's concern is because somebody almost died because the people there are not medically qualified to understand all that you need to understand for a woman to be able to have a safe pregnancy. And a complaint was filed against that center, basically saying they engage in deceptive advertising aiming to persuade women to forego abortions rather than providing them with the range of medically appropriate options. And the plaintiff, who was a Worcester resident, one of my constituents, alleges that the so-called nurse who performed the ultrasound scan at the center did not understand sufficient medical measures to ensure the pregnancy was viable. An ectopic pregnancy, was what she was dealing with, occurs when a fertilized egg implants and grows outside of the uterus, most often in the fallopian tube. Such pregnancies are usually non-viable, and they can be life-threatening. And the suit alleges that the woman's fallopian tube ruptured about a month after the ultrasound scan, causing massive internal bleeding and necessitating emergency surgery. And my constituent's not saying that the nurse or whoever it was intentionally misled her. Instead, they're saying that the staffer missed the ectopic pregnancy because she wasn't qualified to do this. So if we're talking about protecting viable pregnancies and we're talking about protecting the mother, we need to make sure that they're going to places that are properly equipped and staffed to do what is best for the mother. In this case, that did not happen. That did not happen. And the idea that you're diverting TANF monies to help at-risk families and children to support a political agenda that, quite frankly, is terribly unpopular in this country. It's one of the reasons why you're all losing elections. I find to be really disturbing. So I will oppose this bill. But I mean, this obsession with trying to roll back women's rights when it comes to access to abortion or proper health care guidance is something I just don't quite understand. But in any event, I think the only thing is that this will go nowhere, even if it passes the House. But that case that Ms. Chu referred to happened to be in my district. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for any questions she may have.
I don't really have any questions. I think we should all be able to agree on the importance of supporting maternal and infant care, particularly given the shocking rate of maternal mortality in this country, and particularly for women of color. But that's not what this bill does. This bill tries to block a federal regulation of these pregnancy centers, despite the growing body of evidence that many of these centers are deceiving people about whether or not they're actually providing health care, and they're misusing, diverting, and actually defrauding federal taxpayers of dollars that are sent to these places in multiple states, including Pennsylvania and Minnesota, that are not supporting the goals of TANF. So this is almost an oversight function that the federal government has been responding to these reports, which are growing in number, about the misuse of federal dollars in these pregnancy crisis centers and trying to make sure that those dollars are only spent for the purpose. If we were just talking about diapers and formula, we wouldn't, the Department of Human Services would not have issued this regulation. What we're talking about is misuse of federal dollars with deceptive, quote, medical, unquote, practices and actually diversion of dollars. In Pennsylvania, there's been a major contract that's been terminated because it turned out that they were taking dollars that had flowed from the federal government through Pennsylvania and diverting them to other places, and not actually using them to provide services to mothers and children, but for overhead in other states. So I think it's an appropriate function for the federal government. I think it's a mistake to try to block the administration from trying to make sure that these dollars are spent in the way that Congress intended. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for any questions he may have. And gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for any questions she may have.
Thank you, and thank you, Representative Scanlon, for reading the statement, and especially pointing out that the reason we're having these bills when we should be working on funding our government is because there's a rally going on. So this is such a political stunt and, more political theater attacking abortion. And to the statement that these crisis pregnancy centers are just providing information, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an issue brief about crisis pregnancy centers from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists.
Without objection.
So this issue's brief actually describes how these centers are famous and actually use inaccurate information and end up doing things like what we heard about that puts women's lives at risk. One of the misleading practices that these centers do is they assert false risks of abortion. They say there are links between abortion and breast cancer, infertility, mental illness, and preterm birth. They have a long list of the misinformation that they provide, including saying there are legal limits to abortion when there are not. They cause delays in legitimate health care by delaying when women can actually get access to true health care, the doctors that I talked about earlier, that women should be able to consult without interference by politicians, that when you delay that, you can delay assessing difficulties of pregnancy, whether you choose to keep a pregnancy, such as if you're diabetic or other things, or choosing to terminate the pregnancy so that you don't go beyond limits, as states are now imposing 6-week limits, 4-week limits, 8-week limits, whatever limits they're doing. And by delaying that, you are actually delaying a woman's choice. And so I think that, it is wise for us to listen to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They are the experts in this realm. And so I, would enter that into the record. I also am very curious, as I read through the record of how this moved through committee, that we actually had Representative Del Bene submitting an amendment that said pregnancy centers cannot provide medically inaccurate information, just holding them to that standard. That's not such a high standard, like be accurate. And Republicans voted that amendment down. So once again, we keep seeing Republicans voting down amendments to try to make these bills actually scientific-based. And Republicans keep saying no. And I think this should tell the American public, Republicans do not want our women to have accurate medical information about their health care choices, period. We need to hold them accountable, and we say that's not acceptable. We will make our decisions, and we will make those decisions, and we'll make sure they are heard at the ballot boxes, which is what we have seen over and over again every time this issue of reproductive freedom, of health care, and women being able to have the freedom to make their own health care decisions in conversation with their own faith, whatever that faith may be, that women are speaking loudly. And I hope they keep speaking loudly so that politicians, like those who have brought this bill, will stay out of their doctor's office. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady is recognized to respond.
Mr. Chair, thank you. It comes from the fact that the Biden administration chose to target these life-affirming centers. The pregnancy care centers were receiving TANF funds, so it's not diverting, it's not adding them. this TANF dollars going to those pregnancy care centers is existing, and the Biden administration chose to go after them. What they are doing is limiting state flexibility, because the states have the flexibility right now to choose or to not to send it where they want. That is the purpose of the TANF, the way that the TANF bill was written. The program was put together. Many of the crisis pregnancy centers adhere to national standards. They are part of a national network. They adhere to standards and ethics. And I have been to a pregnancy care center, just like Dr. Burgess has been. And what you see is you see caring, compassionate people who are there to care for the mother and the child during pregnancy and after pregnancy. And we had stories in during the Ways and Means markup on this bill that talked about many years of being supported by these pregnancy care centers and children that grew up. And I believe it was Dr. Westrup's who his wife worked at a crisis pregnancy center or volunteered at a crisis pregnancy center. This is not what the other side wants to make it out to be. These are good places, helpful places. They care for the mother and the child. And that's why you hear about, the fundraising that they do to add to the TANF dollars. So this is actually a value for us, because they do a lot of private fundraising. They do a lot of fundraising for baby items so that they can send home with the mother and the baby, cribs, diapers, whatever it may be. And so it's not these pregnancy care centers are not what the other side is trying to make them out to be. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you for appearing before us today. Gentlelady's excused, and we hope she returns to the dais.